Have you heard of Betty and Barney Hill? They were the first mainstream publicized case of alien abduction in the United States, and many believe them to be the start to the trend of reports of alien encounters and abductions. Many questions about the case have been brought up, including the reasoning behind it all. Was it a hoax to gain fame and notoriety? Or was it a real case of abduction? Before we jump in, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, followed by the bell notifications. Let's dive into the story of Betty and Barney Hill. Betty and Barney Hill were an American couple in the state of New Hampshire. Barney, a postal worker, and Betty, a social worker, were also both big civil rights advocates who claimed to have been abducted by aliens from September 19th to September 20th, 1961. They were the first widely publicized case of alien abduction in the United States and became a mainstream fixture as the masses were so fascinated by the story. The case became known as the Hill abduction, or the Zeta Reticuli incident, because the couple stated the aliens were from the Zeta Reticuli system. According to several reports given by the Hills, the alleged UFO sighting and abduction began September 19, 1961 at around 10:30 p.m. The Hills were driving back from a vacation in Montreal and the Niagara Falls when Betty claimed to have seen a bright light in the sky that was moving, claiming it looked like a falling star moving upward. Since the bright object was moving sporadically and grew brighter and bigger, Betty told Barney to stop the car for a closer look while they walked their dog. So, Barney pulled over at a scenic picnic spot just south of the Twin Mountains. While there, Betty observed the odd-shaped light through binoculars and noticed it was flashing multicolored lights while it traveled. Betty assumed it was a flying saucer because several years prior, Betty's sister claimed to have seen one. Barney, though, disagreed as he believed it was just a plane. He began tracking its flight path, believing it was headed to Montreal. He noticed it seemed to change directions, heading towards them. They quickly jumped into the car and continued down the road, but driving slowly to keep an eye on the object. As it got closer, Betty said the object seemed to rotate and was about 40 feet long, and noticed this silent craft bouncing around the night sky in ways that planes could not. Eventually, the craft rapidly descended towards the hills and hovered about 80 to 100 feet above the 1957 Chevy Bel Air and filled the field and windshield with its mass. Barney said it reminded him of a huge pancake. Carrying a pistol in his pocket, he stopped the car and stepped away, moving closer to the object. Using the binoculars, he noticed 8 to 11 humanoid figures that were looking out the craft's windows. All but one humanoid moved to the rear panel, and the one that stayed looking through the window delivered a message telling Barney to stay put and keep looking. Barney claimed the humanoids were wearing black uniforms and a black cap. As a long structure began to descend from the bottom of the craft, bright LED lights came out of it as well. As the craft approached, he sprinted back to the car in an hysterical state and told Betty they were going to capture them. They drove at high speeds to get away from the craft, and Betty rolled down the window to keep an eye on the ship when vibrations and loud beeps and buzzing sounds bounced off the vehicle, feeling it through their bodies. The Hills claimed they began to feel an altered state of consciousness that left their minds dull. When a second round of buzzes snapped them back into full consciousness, they realized that they had traveled 35 miles south, but only had vague, spotty memories of the road. They claimed they made unplanned and sudden turns, encountered roadblocks and observed orbs on the road, but feel it was an implanted memory. Then, on October 21st, 1961, Barney reported the encounter to the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, or the NICAP, and was adamant they were not human. After the encounter, the Hills returned home but left all their luggage at the back door and immediately took several showers in order to remove any possible contamination. They both wrote down and drew pictures of their encounters and what they remembered. The issue was, whenever they got to the point of the loud buzzing, their memories were blank. They knew something had to have happened because their clothes were torn, shoes damaged, and the leather strap of the binoculars were ripped. Barney examined his genital area, but found nothing out of the norm. Betty noticed a pink powder on her dress and that it was completely ruined. Initially, she threw the dress away, but shortly after retrieved it to hand over for examination, which the dress was examined for over 5 years. On September 21st, 1961, Betty notified the Peace Air Force Base to report the UFO encounter, but left out some details for fear of being crazy. On September 22nd, the Hills were contacted by Major Paul Henderson, who wanted more information. September 26th, Henderson released his report stating some information was inaccurate, but may be due to optical condition, and said there was insufficient data. His report, 100-1-61, was sent to Project Blue Book, the United States Air Force UFO Research Project. Betty began to research UFO encounters and read Major Donald Kehoe, who was the head of the NICAP, a civilian UFO research group. On September 26th, Betty sent a letter to Kehoe, detailing the entirety of the incident without any info being left out this time. Betty said herself and Barney were open to hypnosis to help recall the incident. Her letter would be passed to Walter Webb, a Boston astronomer and NICAP member. Webb met the Hills on October 21st, 1961, and conducted a 6-hour interview detailing the entirety of the incident. But Barney said he had a mental block of sorts and wasn't sure he wanted to uncover those memories. Webb concluded that they were telling the truth overall, but some details may have been inaccurate based on human error, such as trauma, lack of knowledge, perception, and human judgment. The Hills would be interviewed at length by the NICAP several times, and the biggest question seemed to be around the missing time that should have only been a 4-hour trip, but took more than several hours, and they had no answers as to why. When hypnosis was brought up about, Barney was extremely against it, but thought maybe it would put Betty's dreams to rest, which he believed were total nonsense. The Hills began to take frequent trips to the spot, where it all hoped to jog the memory, but to no avail. Betty, 10 nights after the incident, began to have extremely vivid and detailed dreams, almost as if reliving the moments. She had these dreams for exactly 5 nights, then they never returned. She told Barney, but Barney brushed them off, stating they were nothing to worry about, so Betty never mentioned them again. She wrote down the events in her dreams, stating that there was a roadblock surrounded by 5 men, and they lost consciousness. When she regained consciousness, she was being forced to walk by 2 men into the woods and saw Barney, though he was in a sleepwalking state. They took Barney and Betty into a disc-shaped craft and separated them once inside. The leader, as she called him, said the examinations would take much longer if they were together. The examiner, as Betty called it, entered the room with the leader and began the examinations. The examiner spoke imperfect English, so she had a hard time understanding him. He placed her in a chair with a bright light and cut a lock of her hair, saved fingernail trimmings, examined her eyes, ears, nose, throat, teeth, and hands. After examining her legs and arms, took a dull knife similar to a letter opener and scraped skin into an object resembling cellophane. They tested her nervous system by plunging needles into her navel, and when she screamed in agonizing pain, the leader simply waved his hands over her eyes, and the pain stopped. The examiner left, and her and the leader began to conversate. She asked where they were from, and he showed her a map of a star system pointing to the location in which he lived. She picked up a book with a strange symbol that the leader said she could take home with her. But once they began to escort her off the ship, an argument with the other aliens began, and the leader told Betty they didn't want her to remember, and that she had to return the book. But Betty told the leader, one day, I would remember. Betty and Barney were returned to their car and watched the ship leave and begin to drive home. The Hills made both private and public statements regarding their encounters, both while they were at church. Their first private statement at the church was on November 23, 1962, after a special guest speaker, Ben Sweat of the United States Air Force, was discussing his book of poetry when the pastor of the church asked a question about his personal interest in hypnosis. After the meeting, the Hills spoke with Captain Sweat privately and told him of the encounter. Sweat was particularly fascinated by the missing time. The Hills asked Sweat if he thought hypnosis would help with the missing time, but he claimed he was no expert and cautioned them going to an amateur hypnotist. Their first public discussion was when Sweat returned and gave a discussion on hypnosis. After that meeting, the Hills spoke to Sweat again and told him that Barney was seeing a psychiatrist who referred him to a gentleman by the name of Benjamin Simon who could conduct hypnosis. They also discussed their story publicly on November 3, 1973, to an amateur UFO group in Massachusetts. Fast forward to January 4, 1964, when the Hills began hypnosis sessions with Dr. Simon. Simon hypnotized both Barney and Betty several times, but always separated them so the other could not overhear. Simon realized that the incident had caused Barney a lot of anxiety and stress, and that both Betty and Barney Hill truly believed witnessed a UFO. Barney was the first to be hypnotized. He spoke about seeing a non-human figure. Barney revealed that the strap had broken when he was running in a panic back to his car, and as he drove away, he felt compelled to pull over to a dirt road in the woods. There, humanoids were standing in front of the vehicle on the dirt road. He relayed that the leader told him to close his eyes during the abduction, and that the leader's eyes felt as if they were impressing against his. When discussing the abduction under hypnosis, he became extremely emotional, and you could see the fear settling in. He relayed essentially the same thing as Betty's dream, which clearly were not dreams but actual events. He spoke about being brought up in a disc-like ship where he and Betty were separated, and an examiner did experiments on him, but described the experience in far less detail than Betty because he kept his eyes closed for most of the examination. He laid on a rectangular examiner's table, had a cup-like device placed over his genitals, and he said he felt like he did not orgasm, but that sperm samples were collected, as well as skin samples. They examined his ears and mouth, and someone counted his vertebrae while they felt his spine, and they quickly inserted and removed a small tube from his anus. He said they spoke in a language that sounded like mumble, but sometimes spoke in English, though felt it wasn't so much speaking as it was thought impressing. He recalled leaving the ship disoriented, returned to his car, and watched the ship depart. Betty's hypnosis accounts were essentially her 5 dreams to a T, though there were some notable differences. Mostly with the capture and release, the technology on the craft was also much different. The aliens had different appearances, and the order of events were much different than that of her dreams. Though Betty and Barney's stories under hypnosis were a match with one another, they differed from Betty's dreams. Betty was extremely emotional, and Simon had to end one of their sessions early because of the extreme motion coming from Betty. After a session, Simon had Betty draw what she could remember from the map that was shown to her. She said it was almost a 3D image, but she would do her best. She said that there were thousands of stars, but she drew the ones that truly stood out in her memory. The map consisted of 12 prominent stars connected by lines, and 3 lesser stars that formed a distinct triangle. She said that the lines for the stars were the trade routes, where the dashed lines were less traveled. After the session, Simon concluded that both Betty and Barney Hill's recollection may have been a fantasy inspired by Betty's dreams. Simon said that his conclusion was the most reasonable and consistent conclusion to be explained, Barney disagreed with this idea and was ready to accept that he was abducted by aliens, and noted, though that they had very similar experiences, there were very notable differences that couldn't have been caused by Betty's dreams. Even though Simon and Hills disagreed, they agreed that the session of hypnosis was very effective. After their hypnosis experience, both Betty and Barney Hill were much more open to discussing what happened with friends and family, but made no attempt to seek publicity. Though on October 25, 1965, a front-page story in the Boston Traveler asked for info about couples being abducted. Reporter John Luttrell was allegedly given audio, lectures, and the reports of the Hills, as well as knowledge they underwent hypnosis, and even obtained the confidential files from the interview with the UFO investigators. Who gave the info isn't known. Many say it wasn't the Hills, for they never once tried to seek any attention, though they had opportunities. On October 26th, the United Press International picked up the Luttrell story, which caused the Hills to receive international attention. This sparked the alien encounter and abduction craze, where people all over became more open about their stories. Many articles, books, etc. were created around the Betty and Barney Hill story, as people tried to exploit the fame surrounding the Hills and aliens. In 1966, writer John Fuller secured and wrote a book along with the Hills titled The Interrupted Journey, which even includes the map of the stars. It became a quick success and went through several prints. Later in life, Betty claimed to have seen UFOs countless times after the abduction, though this was her only personal encounter. She became a huge pillar and staple in the alien and UFO communities, but died of cancer at age 85 in 2004. Barney, he died in 1969 at age 46 from cerebral hemorrhages, so unfortunately, he never got the chance to become an active pillar. Of course, with all believers came a ton of skeptics and people that tried to disprove the Hills. One huge aspect was a popular TV show, The Outer Limits, aired an episode about 2 weeks before hypnosis that was very similar to how the aliens and their eyes were described. Betty, when asked about this years later, said that at the time they had no knowledge of the show. The biggest reasoning skeptics had behind why the Hills would create such an elaborate story was the fact that they were an interracial couple in the 60s, and that the stress is what caused hallucinations and dreams of abduction. These were merely a symbolic metaphor of the times that they lived in. Others say they wanted to be more accepted and not have to deal with the fact that they were interracial, so they fabricated a story for attention to make them famous and distract people from their relationship. Though, to me, this one is tough, because the Hills never tried to capitalize off their story. Outside of a few books, they never fully tried to gain anything, even when they could. Up as recently as 2015, there have been reports, articles, and papers published to discredit the Hills story. But as with all videos I do like this, I leave it up to you to decide. Leave a comment and let me know what you think. Was their story a real abduction story? Or were there other factors in play that caused this fabrication? If you want to support the channel or have a story to tell, check out the description down below. Follow me on social media, Instagram, TikTok, and my Facebook group, where we share personal stories and discussions. Lastly, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel, followed by the bell notifications so you never miss an upload.